It began not with a trumpet of victory, but with the hollow breath of the Volga wind drifting through fields of broken glass. In a letter never sent, a Soviet private wrote, "There was no line between the living and the dead that winter, only a pause where we waited to learn which side we were on." His words, later found folded between rations, offer the entryway into one of history's most implosive moments, the Battle of Stalingrad, where steel and will collided so absolutely that even time seemed to fracture. It was the autumn of 1942 when two vast machines of ideology, Hitler's Wehrmacht and Stalin's Red Army, met beside a river that wound through an industrial city already trembling under bombs. Yet beneath the tectonic rumble of strategy lived lives like his, simple, finite, yet capable of memory that refused to die. And so the question unfolds quietly but unrelentingly: how does a human heart remain recognizable amid a war that aims to unmake everything human? By mid-1942, the Second World War had reached what many believed to be its decisive threshold. Nazi Germany, buoyed by rapid conquests from the Channel to the Don, sought to seize the Soviet Union's southern expanse, the bridge to Caucasian oil, and the symbolic prize of the city that bore Stalin's name. The German command called it Fall Blau, Operation Blue, a campaign designed to strangle the Soviet state by cutting its arteries of fuel and industry. In Berlin, Goebbels's broadcasts painted victory as preordained, maps flared with red arrows sweeping eastward. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the rhetoric of survival hardened into creed. Factories dismantled in haste were rebuilt beyond the Urals. Whole populations dug earthworks with hands blistered from frost and hunger. While generals moved pins across maps, civilians learned to move entire cities, one workshop at a time. Stalingrad itself was a modest city by imperial standards, stretched along the western bank of the Volga and pulsing with heavy industry. The Red October steel plant hammered out the bones of tanks, the Barricadi factory forged artillery, the tractor plant produced engines for battlefields already raging hundreds of kilometers away. Its workers lived in modest barracks and shared communal courtyards, shaded by birch and smoke. By summer, all that familiarity trembled. The first reconnaissance flights appeared above the river on the 23rd of August 1942, glinting silver in the afternoon sun before dropping a load of bombs that set fuel depots alight. Within hours, firestorms raced through warehouses and tram lines, fusing glass to pavement. The next dusk, survivors wandered the quays carrying enamel pots filled with river water for burns that could not be soothed. Among them, newly arrived to the banks, was a young man named Alexei Morozov. He was 20, from near Tver, a place of tall pines and wooden eaves, where winter smelled of resin and bread crust. He had learned carpentry from his father before the draft took him eastward. His first uniform was too large, the cap stiff with new cloth. When his train halted near the ferry crossing to Stalingrad's east shore, the air was metallic, vibrating under distant shell fire. The horizon itself was burning, he would later recount to an interviewer decades afterward. We believed the war waited ahead of us, but it was already here, in the river, in the smoke, in our breath. Just beyond that same waterline, a different story began. Anna Petrovna, a volunteer nurse from Leningrad, arrived with a medical detachment of the 62nd Army. She had once studied literature before the siege of her own city closed the university. Writing and nursing had little in common, she thought, until she realized both required the same discipline, to bear witness without turning away. She wrote briefly in a notebook bound with cloth, snippets of routine, questions phrased so carefully they resembled prayers. This morning, 50 wounded men, some younger than I. We sleep in the morgue because it is the only place with walls thick enough to stand the shelling. Her world narrowed to the scent of iodine, the muffled groan of stretchers scraping across concrete, the taste of dust that clung to tea. Through these two lives, the private and the nurse, the vast machine of war acquires pulse and perspective. Their paths did not cross in time, yet together they frame the human vector of an ordeal stretching from the July heat of the steppe to the frozen grey of February. Both became fragments of a larger chorus, one that sang without melody, without victory, only endurance. To understand their ordeal is to grasp the layers surrounding it, political, logistical, and existential. By the summer of 1942, Germany's eastern advance had consumed territories where millions now lived under occupation. Hitler's confidence grew absolute. He believed the Soviet state a decapitated beast, its armies spent after the chaos of 1941. Within the German General Staff, voices of caution, most notably those of Halder and Zeitzler, spoke of stretched lines and uncertain supply chains. They were dismissed. The Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus, supported by the 4th Panzer Army, was tasked to seize Stalingrad, while southern elements of Army Group A drove into the Caucasus. The plan's ambition far outstripped its logistics. Fuel consumption rates were underestimated, railway repair lagged. Yet momentum carried them forward. For the Soviet command, those weeks were a race against annihilation. Joseph Stalin, still reeling from the disasters of 1941, issued Order Number 227 on 28 July 1942, Ni shagu nazad, not one step back. The decree made retreat punishable by execution, a measure both of desperation and discipline. General Vasily Trikov, later appointed commander of the 62nd Army, understood that survival meant entangling the enemy inside the ruins, where the advantages of tanks and air power would wither. His doctrine, shaped mid-battle, reduced warfare to the human scale, fight for every floor, every stairwell, every brick. In that struggle, civilians became unwilling participants. Before the German advance completed its siege, approximately 400,000 residents remained trapped. Elderly couples, factory women, children, many refused evacuation, persuaded by propaganda that the city would stand or by fear of abandoning homes already bombed into despair. Water lines burst, food stocks dwindled, and the Volga became both lifeline and grave. Each night barges attempted to cross under fire to deliver flour, ammunition, and, increasingly, morphine. The ferrymen learned to steer by the glow of burning oil on the water's surface. As September deepened, the rhythm of life compressed into moments between bombardments. Private Morozov's letters, several preserved in a family archive, sketch a portrait less of heroism than of adaptation. "We live under the ground 3 meters down. Rats are calmer than we are. We heat nails to make water clean." He speaks of comrades from distant republics, Uzbeks, Georgians, Russians from the Don, and of sharing watch duty under a half-collapsed wall where snow sifted like ash. For him, the machinery of ideology felt remote. What remained tangible was the need to hold a line measured in the width of a street. Anna's notes evoke a parallel isolation. Her field hospital occupied the basement of what had once been a technical institute. There were no windows, only a single vent near the ceiling that carried in the tremor of artillery. She counted days by the arrival of the wounded, 40, then 80, then so many she stopped recording. "Sometimes," she wrote, "I think the earth raises its children only to give them back." On one page, she sketched a crude outline of the city as remembered from before the shelling, avenues, parks, the theatre. She annotated them with words like "gone" and "maybe" still there. Such notes hint not simply at loss, but at an instinct to catalogue existence, to prove that something had preceded the ruins. The broader geopolitical frame darkened as autumn advanced. In mid-September, German units penetrated the central districts, dividing the Soviet defences near the Saritsa Gorge. The Luftwaffe maintained near constant bombardment, described by Western correspondents as an artificial eclipse, the sky thick with soot. Soviet reinforcements poured across the river nightly, packaged in silence. Men ferried with rifles wrapped in cloth to prevent glint. Medical boats carrying nurses and the maimed side by side. By October, temperatures fell below freezing, coating wrecks and corpses alike in frost that blurred distinction. Yet despite the devastation, neither side relinquished claim. Hitler insisted during a meeting recorded on the 8th of November 1942 that Stalingrad will be taken whatever the cost. Stalin's answer, relayed through Pravda editorials, was equally absolute. The Volga would not bend. Such symmetry of defiance produced one of the most static yet violent confrontations in military history. Analysts later described Stalingrad as a battle of attrition nested inside a battle of annihilation, but for those within its circumference, the soldiers, nurses, civilians, the categories dissolved. Hunger replaced rhetoric. Command became rumor. In their letters and diaries, repeated phrases emerge: smoke thicker than thought, time without hours, we forget what quiet sounds like. Even ordinary sights took on eerie permanence. In propaganda photographs, some preserved despite censorship, one sees soldiers huddled behind walls perforated by bullets, a samovar steaming beside an ammunition crate, frozen laundry rippling like banners. Life persisted in gestures of defiance so small they might have been invisible to outsiders. Anna once recorded sewing makeshift gloves from gauze because deliveries had ceased. She described the strange elegance of those translucent hands moving through lamplight. "We stitched, not warmth," she wrote, "but proof of still being alive." Meanwhile, far from the city, the machinery of global strategy churned. In Washington and London, intelligence analysts debated whether Stalingrad's fall would open the gateway to the Persian oil corridor. In Tokyo, diplomats speculated on the eventual collapse of Soviet resistance. But for Alexei and Anna, such maps of grand consequence were never visible. Their landscapes were rooms without ceilings, stairways leading to open sky, nights measured by the distance between one explosion and the next. The Soviet state's control of narrative was thorough. Newspapers printed heroic sketches of workers continuing to forge steel amid bombardment, a truth half symbol, half survival. Yet many civilians did remain at their posts. In the Red October plant's foundry, one surviving engineer later testified that the last furnace went cold only in late October 1942, when enemy fire destroyed the smokestacks. For the private, these stories were fuel. For the nurse, they were unbearable reminders that labor continued even as life slipped away. "Each soldier who reaches us," Anna wrote, "carries the weight of an entire factory on his back." Amid such enormity, the human need to believe in individual meaning persisted. Diaries from both sides reveal flashes of sympathy too fragile to express openly. A captured German medic recorded giving water to a Soviet prisoner under a staircase, noting, "He looked like my younger brother." We did not speak these faint gestures, momentary bridges across a sea of propaganda, suggest that even within machinery built for dehumanization, conscience occasionally flickered. Winter crept in through the cracks of ruined buildings. The Volga froze in patches, then solid sheets. Ice became pathway and peril alike. Soviet ferries now moved under cover of blizzards, blending with frost-white air. Supplies diminished, yet orders remained absolute. For the wounded, for the nurses, for the exhausted infantrymen clutching rifles they could barely lift, the horizon narrowed to the next dawn. Each day survived was both triumph and punishment. Private Morozov wrote one last surviving entry near the end of October. "We fight not because we are told, but because there is nowhere left to go." That sentence, raw and unadorned, resonates beyond its moment, a summary of a city reduced to determination itself. Through the lens of his endurance and Anna's quiet fortitude, the immense historical theatre contracts into something intimately human. Stalingrad ceases to be merely an operation or a statistic. It becomes an experiment in survival, where compassion and discipline fuse indistinguishably. This immersion in human endurance does not minimize the military or political calculus surrounding them, but rather restores to it the pulse that history often erases. As November approached and the first snow sealed over the rubble, both armies braced for developments none could yet foresee. The city's skyline, a jagged manuscript of blackened girders, stood as both monument and warning. Beneath it, deep within basements lit by oil lamps trembling in the draught, the private and the nurse endured another night, unaware that the tide, about to shift, would transform their ordeal into legend and catastrophe alike. And in the hush, before another bombardment, Frost settling upon the river's pale surface, history bent in their direction once more, preparing its next turn of fate. The first weeks of November 1942 brought winds that scoured the plains east of Stalingrad like a living thing. The battle, until then a relentless stalemate, was about to pivot. In the trenches near the Red October factory, Alexei Morozov watched the smoke shift against the frozen skyline and tried to read omens in the clouds. The air reeked of spent powder and rust. Beneath it, the Volga hissed, where fragments of ice collided with drifting wreckage. Commanders spoke little of the broader plan, but rumors carried through the rubble, of reinforcements gathering far north and south, of German supply lines stretched thin, of snow that would soon swallow roads whole. "Something is moving behind the white," one sergeant whispered, as if naming movement itself might betray it. At higher levels of command, that whispers materialized into calculation. Soviet High Command under Zhukov and Vasilevsky had crafted a counter-offensive that would exploit the Axis flanks, sectors held not by the German elite, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian units left with inadequate anti-tank weapons. The plan, Operation Uranus, aimed not to retake the city directly, but to encircle the besiegers and starve them within their own conquest. Timing rested on meteorology and deception. Blizzards concealed troop movements, coded transmissions overrun with statistical jargon misled German intelligence. In the ruins, ordinary soldiers sensed nothing of the orchestration beyond an odd increase in distant artillery. For the German Sixth Army, commanded by Friedrich Paulus, the situation was deceptive in another way. Reports from the field described Soviet resistance as dispersed, though by November, that dispersion had become density. Paulus's divisions had entered Stalingrad expecting a swift capture of an industrial node. Instead, they found the city transformed into an organism that swallowed men whole. Every house, furnace, and sewer trench served as ambush. The geography that once produced steel now refined desperation. German command believed victory depended on seizing the riverbank. Soviet planners understood that holding even a ribbon of that bank meant life. Inside her makeshift hospital, Anna Petrovna marked the days of deepening winter through the character of wounds: burns in September, shrapnel in October, frostbite in November, and snowblindness in December-October, and now frostbite in November. Amputations became routine. The medical staff wrote requests for basic anesthetics but received crates of ammunition instead. The radio that once broadcast patriotic speeches now repeated evacuation orders for the wounded who could still walk. "We are told to send them across the river," she wrote in what would be her thinnest winter entry, "but the boats do not come." On the 19th of November, before dawn, the snow began falling in thin horizontal sheets. Then came the thunder of the counterattack. North of the city, Soviet armor surged from its positions near Serafimovich. A day later, from the steppe south of Kalash, another front ignited. The ground shuddered. To Alexei and his comrades, the echo of guns arrived through distance, like a storm rolling through metal. They understood only that the direction of artillery had changed, that strikes once inbound were now aimed elsewhere. For the first time in months, the tone of the city shifted from defense to something like momentum. "We heard the world move," he later said, "and none of us dared to believe it." Operation Uranus rolled forward with precision and brutal weather as its ally. The Romanian Third Army, attacked under fog, broke within days. Within 4, Soviet spearheads linked at Kalash on Don, trapping an estimated 250,000 Axis troops inside the Stalingrad pocket. Paulus requested permission to break out westward. Hitler refused, insisting that air supply would sustain his army. The words "Fortress Stalingrad" entered the record, an illusion that condemned whole regiments. For the next 10 weeks, the besiegers became the besieged. Anna's hospital was ordered to relocate deeper under the earth into abandoned tunnels beneath the Barricadi plant. Frost thickened on every surface, scalpels froze to metal trays. The staff developed rituals to stay coherent: a prayer before dawn, 3 sips of boiled water each afternoon. "We lose count of night and morning," she wrote, paraphrasing what she called the city's single heartbeat. Occasionally, captured Germans were brought in, young, gaunt, disoriented. Most could barely speak. She tended them cautiously, aware that compassion might invite discipline, but unable to refuse. "When I pour water at their lips," she wrote, "they stare as if remembering a sound they once called home." Morozov's unit now pushed block by block, reclaiming alleys they had surrendered weeks earlier. Ammunition was limited to what could be pried from frozen packs of the dead. Bayonets and grenades replaced rifles in close quarters. In one half-collapsed apartment he found a piano intact amid the wreckage. When a shell hit nearby, a single string trembled, sounding what he described as a note neither living nor mechanical, like the city itself breathing. Later, he would speak little of combat and more of the hunger that governed their existence. Soldiers scraped frost from metal to drink. When barn cats appeared, they were greeted like miracles. Orders remained the same: hold, advance, endure. The Luftwaffe's attempt at resupply marked a turning tragedy. Promised at least 500 tons of daily provisions, the encircled soldiers received barely 1/10 that amount. Fuel vanished, vehicles stood buried in snowdrifts, dead horses froze upright, stiff as statues. Diaries of German officers recovered after the war tell of men tearing wallpaper to chew the paste or boiling belts for broth. Broadcasts from Berlin continued to declare, "Victory lies within our grasp." Inside the pocket, victory was starvation with flags. At the river crossings, Soviet ferrymen braved machine gun fire to bring over supplies. One entry from a Volga pilot's log reads, "We count crossings not by number but by who returns." It captures the monotony of peril, each trip a coin tossed to chance. Anna sometimes heard the engines overhead and paused her work to measure intervals between bombardments. When silence lasts more than a minute, she noted, someone has reached the other side. December arrived under storms that erased shadows. Manstein's attempt at relief, Operation Winter Storm, advanced from Kotelnikovo with armoured divisions but halted 50 kilometres short of victory. The sky cleared briefly, revealing burned plains littered with broken vehicles. Within the pocket, Paulus's men listened to distant gunfire recede, like a voice growing tired. Orders from Hitler's headquarters forbade withdrawal. Surrender was unthinkable. One German officer reportedly muttered, "We have become monuments to someone else's pride." For Alexei Morozov, the battle had long ceased to resemble maps. His world shrank to 10 meters ahead, the next structure, the next heartbeat. Frostbite claimed fingers from trigger hands, disease spread through trenches. Yet amid ruin, small kindnesses persisted. He recalled a moment when his squad shared a single tin of condensed milk found in a wrecked storehouse. They divided it with shell casings as spoons, laughing for the first time in weeks. Later, one of them, a boy named Fedya, was killed retrieving water from the Volga. Alexei never forgot the trace of that laughter freezing in his memory. In the medical shelter, Anna confronted an arithmetic of mercy. Supplies dictated survival. She learned to measure morphine not by dosage, but by which patient had a chance to wake. "We make decisions like executioners," she confessed to her diary. "And then we pray afterward, not for forgiveness, but for sleep." At times, she walked outside, seeking air amid fumes, and saw what remained of the city: chimneys without houses, signposts melted into slag, the cathedral dome punctured by light. Snow muffled everything until even the guns seemed tired. By Christmas time, the German Sixth Army was breaking apart. Paulus promoted field cooks to command remnants of regiments. A German radio transmission intercepted on the 24th of December pleaded, "We are surrounded by snow and silence." Meanwhile, Soviet loudspeakers broadcast offers of surrender and the crackling strains of folk songs, the surreal counterpoint of war and lullaby. For soldiers on both sides, those sounds fused with the wind to become part of the city's haunted voice. Within the encirclement, hospitals disintegrated into caverns crowded with wounded. A German medic's surviving note, retrieved after the surrender, mirrors Anna's tone. "We melt snow for water. The wounded are too many, and the lamps too weak. Unlike commands or statistics, such fragments speak the same human dialect, the one that transcends uniforms." Anna never read those opposite words, but she felt their phantom resonance. "Sometimes," she wrote, "I think both sides share a single candle flame. It just burns too quickly to warm anyone." As January 1943 dawned, the final stages commenced. Soviet artillery ringed what remained of the pocket, methodically compressing it. Daily, the front contracted like a noose of smoke. Paulus radioed for permission to surrender. Hitler promoted him to field marshal instead, implying death before capture. The irony settled like frost upon every wall. On the 9th of January, Soviet envoys delivered surrender terms. Silence was the reply. During those last weeks, Alexei was assigned to assault the factory district once more. His unit advanced through corridors clogged with frozen rubble. The resistance was sporadic, but still vicious. He wrote nothing about those days, yet years later admitted that he stopped feeling anger. You reach a point where there is no enemy, only people disappearing. Hunger gnawed through distinctions. Captured Germans were often skeletal boys, the same age as Russians on the other side. Some died standing, their bodies unable to fall. Anna's hospital received more prisoners than patients. She described a single afternoon when a German corporal, delirious with fever, repeated a word she recognized as home. She pressed a cool cloth to his head. He died before sunset. Later that night, she copied a line from a banned poet into her notebook. "Every death enlarges the sky." That was the last entry preserved in her handwriting before victory announcements reached them. The final collapse of the Sixth Army came gradually, not as a roar, but as surrender by exhaustion. In late January 1943, Soviet forces seized the southern sector, splitting Paulus's command in two. The radio messages shortened to whispers: "No ammunition, no food, the wounded have no shelter." On 31st January, Paulus capitulated to Soviet officers in the basement of the Univermag department store. 2 days later, the northern pocket followed. Roughly 90,000 Axis soldiers entered captivity, barely a fraction of those who had stood there months earlier. For survivors like Morozov, the sound of surrender was not jubilation, but stillness. "The world seemed to stop making noise," he said later, "and that silence frightened us more than any shell." Smoke drifted in soft spirals. Dogs wandered among ruins. Women emerged from cellars carrying buckets, as if life were waiting. The devastation exceeded counting. Streets once mapped in detail existed only as paths through ash. The tractor factory, once an emblem of Soviet industry, was now an open skeleton against the sky. Yet within that desolation, people began the first acts of reconstruction, laying fires for warmth, collecting names of the dead, discovering fragments of letters like seeds for memory. Anna remained at her station, documenting survivors, her hands cracked and swollen, but steady. Alexei was transferred to another unit, preparing for the westward push, a movement that would carry him far from the city that had defined his youth. As February unfolded and the Volga ice began to shift beneath a milder wind, both the living and the dead shared the same horizon. Rumors of victory spread, heavy with disbelief. Officials from Moscow arrived to film scenes of triumph, yet the inhabitants moved wordlessly through the debris, searching for faces. Historians would later note that the battle's outcome marked the turning point of the entire Eastern Front, the eclipse of one empire and the rebirth of another. But within the ruins, those transformations felt distant, abstract. For the private and the nurse, survival itself had no anthem, only breath. It was this quiet after the storm, this absence where noise had been, that began to reveal what the months of siege had inflicted. The snow melted into pools crimsoned with rust and soil, reflecting a sun the city had nearly forgotten. Men buried comrades without ceremony. Women gathered scraps of cloth to fashion flags of mourning and resilience. The river, restless and immense, carried debris downstream, ammunition boxes, timbers, once even a child's toy boat. Through it all, the question persistently lingered, hovering above every act of endurance. What had been saved, and at what irreparable cost? No one answered aloud. Instead they worked, remembered, and waited for orders that would point them toward the next horizon. Somewhere beyond the thawing steppe, new campaigns were being drawn on tables, still echoing with the echoes of this one. And as the Volga thawed, its current carried forward the memory of those months, the labor of the living, the silence of the fallen, toward a future that had yet to comprehend the weight of their survival. By March 1943, snowmelt carved its way through the craters outside Stalingrad, tracing shallow veins across what had once been streets. The battle was over, but its measure could not be taken by maps alone. Estimates of the dead vary even now. Roughly 2 million soldiers and civilians consumed over 6 months of ruin, one of the most staggering tolls in recorded warfare. Entire neighborhoods disappeared beneath rubble that still concealed bones when spring arrived. Some historians calculate that between 800,000 Axis soldiers and allies were lost, killed, captured, or missing, while Soviet casualties may have surpassed 1 million, though precise figures remain contested in archives opened long after the war ended. Numbers hover like smoke above the city's concrete scars, fragments of an arithmetic that can never balance. In the immediate aftermath, the air bore an unfamiliar quiet, not peace, but pause. Survivors emerged from cellars carrying ledgers of names, as if accounting might summon meaning. Pigeons returned before electricity did. Soviet banners rose above ruins, and the word victory echoed across radio waves, pronounced slowly, almost uncertainly. Yet for those who had lived through it, triumph was muted. Alexei Morozov, demobilized months later, told an interviewer in 1967, "It was not victory we heard, only an ending, and even that did not sound complete." The global implications rippled outward. Strategically, the German defeat marked the first irreversible crack in Hitler's war machine. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility was gone. Axis supply lines across the Eastern Front collapsed into retreat. Soviet forces seized the initiative that would carry them westward to Berlin within 2 years. In London, Washington, and even in neutral capitals, the name Stalingrad became shorthand for defiance under impossible odds. The Red Army's endurance, once doubted, earned grim respect. Yet behind the rhetoric of turning points lay the survival of a city that had lost nearly all it had sought to defend. Politically, Stalingrad bolstered Stalin's authority to an almost mythic degree. Proclamations celebrated the unbreakable spirit of the Soviet people, transforming a devastated landscape into proof of ideological triumph. Streets were renamed, medals struck. The title Hero City would later sanctify the ruins. This construction of memory remains a matter of interpretation. Official records emphasized heroism, but seldom acknowledged the desperation that underwrote it, the executions under Order 227, or the civilians trapped by propaganda as much as by siege. Historians continue to debate whether necessity or ruthlessness defined Soviet command decisions. Morality and strategy are seldom separable in war, and Stalingrad offers bleak testimony to that. For those within the encirclement's aftermath, however, politics existed only as a distant shadow. Anna Petrovna remained in the ruins until late 1943, overseeing the evacuation of refugees to new settlements upriver. Her last known letter, addressed to a colleague, spoke of tending to orphans found in wreckage. "They do not know the word victory," she wrote. "They only ask where the snow has taken their mothers." After that, her trace disperses into silence, the same quiet engulfing countless others whose lives merged with the landscape they survived. Over the following decades, Stalingrad, eventually renamed Volgograd, underwent reconstruction that was equal parts engineering and ritual. Monuments sprouted where nothing grew before. Factories reopened, housing blocks rose, and the colossal statue "The Motherland Calls" stretched her arm above the steppe, both sword and lament. Tourists came to photograph endurance embodied in stone. Yet beneath the layers of paint and asphalt, the city remained built atop its dead. Residents still uncovered relics when digging gardens or laying pipes, fragments of uniforms, corroded bullets, shards of dishes marked 1942, memories seeped from the soil. Among the surviving soldiers, moral reckonings emerged sporadically. For Germans who endured captivity, the battle became a symbol of futility engineered by pride. For Soviets, it embodied sacrifice sanctified by necessity. Each narrative sought coherence, neither found peace. Military theorists dissected the event for tactical lessons, urban warfare, logistics, the coordination of combined arms, but those diagrams stripped the battle of its human weight. The terrain, weather, and industrial density taught the world the price of underestimating endurance. Yet the deeper lesson, if one exists, lies not in strategy but compassion withheld too long. To distinguish fact from interpretation is to confront discomfort. The certainties of victory blur when revisited through the eyes of those who merely endured. Stalingrad demonstrated that war's geometry is not only measured in territory gained or lost, but in the distortion of ordinary life, the collapse of moral coordinates that turn survival into both triumph and guilt. Scholars argue whether the Soviet stand was motivated by ideology, fear, or raw instinct. Perhaps all three. What remains indisputable is that both sides crossed thresholds beyond understanding, proving that courage and cruelty can coexist within one heartbeat. In the decades since, the battle's echo continues to shape reflection on civilian vulnerability and the ethics of total war. Contemporary military planning, humanitarian law, even urban reconstruction theories cite Stalingrad as caution and warning. Yet its emotional residue resists appropriation. It is not reducible to tactical brilliance or patriotic myth. For beneath strategy lies the constant, the fragile presence of a single person, private, nurse, child, performing small acts of endurance that allow history itself to persist. On Memorial Days, the Volga reflects the light of thousands of candles drifting downstream. Some carry names, others only initials. Locals still speak of an hour before dawn when fog rises from the river, carrying the faint metallic scent of old fires. Whether that is mist or memory hardly matters. The city breathes through its losses and continues. In that lingering image, water moving past stones that no longer mark the battle's lines, one perceives the enduring question that neither Alexei Morozov nor Anna Petrovna could answer. Can victory remain pure when purchased through such weight of suffering, or does survival itself become both redemption and burden? The current flows onward, indifferent yet remembering, as if history, like the river, must go on carrying what humanity would rather forget.